Hello, everyone. My name is Bridget Tingandu, and I'm a volunteer with Social Workers Without Borders. I'm also a case coordinator. I'm involved in assessments of on human rights and best interests for children, and also a trustee with Social Workers Without Borders. My day job is that of a senior lecturer in social work at the University of Kent.
My name's Naomi, and I'm the development lead at Social Workers Without Borders. So I'm our first employee. Prior to that, I was I'm a registered social worker, but prior to that, I worked in the local authority with children and families social work. That's probably all you need to know about me. Yeah. Should we start the presentation?
We will indeed. Thank you. So for today's session, we're going to give a bit of a background to Social Workers Without Borders. The other thing we would like to explore is really kind of look at the tensions in the overlap between immigration and asylum law and social care. So throughout our discussion, these themes will come through. And the last point we would like to explore with you is that of what we can do to challenge the hostile environment and maintain our professional values and identity. And for us, those are key aspects of what our profession really is about, social work and its values. So we hope that these themes will come through as we share our experiences with you and the work that we do with in Social Workers Without Borders.
And just to, I think before we get started, really just thinking about the theme of one of the themes of this year's social work, a social work day, social work week, and the sort of the leaving no one behind, and what we're aiming for in our presentation is an exploration of how people's rights and entitlements can be denied to some people, depending on groups of people, and that they need to be protected. And this is a foundation of making sure nobody is left behind. And really, we, as we all have been really aware of and reflecting on what's happening in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, I think the things that we talk about today in our presentation will feel really pertinent to what's kind of at the forefront of our minds for a lot of us. And that situation just really shows us that global instability can touch the lives of any of us and all of us. But at the same time, I think we've done a lot of reflection, that it shows us that some displaced people are really received differently to others. And that's some of what we're going to be reflecting on and thinking about today, and what might be going on there and why.
Okay, so the next slide, where we started. We may remember, people may remember 2014, 2015, and perhaps 2016 in particular, when we saw many people move across the world or certain parts of the world due to instability caused by mainly wars. And one of the things that we started having were conversations about how social work responds to situations when they're happening so close to us. And so when people were moving over to Europe seeking safety, there was a lot happening that really kind of brought that question of what do we do as social workers? What are our values? How do we respond when we have a humanitarian crisis on our doors? And so it was really about thinking of the people who were in Calais, and a group of social workers got together, thinking about the social work expertise we have, and seeing if we can support and help children in particular, unaccompanied young people and their families. We've drawn on a quote from Lynn King, who is one of the founders of Social Workers Without Borders, because I think it captures really that feeling those of us who came together share. about that emotional response to injustice, and perhaps the moral outrage that we see, or we saw at that time and continue to see. So it was really that opportunity to ask questions about where are we placed as social workers when things are happening around us? How do we revisit those values that are core to our practice? Next, please. Okay. So where we are now, Social Workers Without Borders is a registered charity. We were registered in 2017, and our work is now based in the UK. So although we started off in France, in Calais, our work has really had that British context to it. We've been working in the British judiciary system. So the work that we do draws on UK legislation. And it is actually thinking about what is happening in Britain in the context of immigration and borders. So we have 5 trustees on our board, 11 steering group members, 1 paid employee, Naomi, who's with us, and very much supported by a network of social workers who volunteer with us. And it is about that collective professional voice for us that is emerging and has continued to emerge within Social Workers Without Borders. So there are 3 main strands to the work we do. The first strand really is direct work, and I've alluded to this in the form of assessments that we undertook in Calais and continuing to do in the work that we're doing here in the UK. And this is about providing independent social work reports. And these are important when expert evidence is required for the children and families or adults that we're supporting in immigration and asylum cases. So that's really an important aspect of our work. We have a campaigns team, which is about raising the awareness of hostile environment. And this is really about challenging government policies and Home Office practice, so that we're coming back to those values and really questioning things. So it's not just about accepting policies that are disadvantaging certain groups in our society, but being able to voice our opinion, being able to say what we think is not right, and offer opportunities for things to be made right. The third one is the education aspect. So essentially what Naomi and I are doing this evening, sharing our experience. It is about delivering specialist workshops. We've done that to students across the years. We presented conferences. But it is also about developing that allyship with professionals and really seeing social work as a profession that can contribute and work alongside other professionals. And for us, it is also about contributing to the improvement of social work practice, being able to challenge ourselves as practitioners and question what kind of practice we do and what we would like it to be, and where those tensions may arise in regards to our values. So our work now also includes reunifications. I've talked about separated children. We do assessments under Article 8 for adults. And these are areas that are continuing to grow in our organization and in our provision of support. There is a very strong ethical foundation, I'm sure, as you can sense already. One of the things for us is that social work is not a fixed model. It is important that we're always mindful of the broader context and the different contexts in which social work exists, in which social work is practiced. But I think it is one of the important things for us is thinking about those fundamental international principles of what makes good social work. And if we can keep asking ourselves and come back to that, I think we won't lose sight of our values. I take a quote here from Lauren Rowe, who is the second co-founder of Social Workers Without Borders, and where she talks about a commitment to social work practice premised on human rights and social justice. And I know these are very familiar concepts and values to us, but I think also quite important that we are reflecting and reflective of what they mean in our world today, actually, and how we're implementing them, how we're demonstrating this in our practice. Next slide, please. So Social Workers Without Borders then is grounded in social justice and rights-based approach to social work. This means that we recognize that everyone has an intrinsic right, actually, rather than being designated. Quite often in social work, we talk about deserving and not deserving, and that continues today, where we think about who is eligible, who is not eligible of a service, who is eligible of support, who is not eligible of support. And so if we keep to our core values here of social work being based on respect for the inherent worth and dignity of all people, I think that we've got a solid ground where we can always come back to if we feel we are sort of steering away from our core values. We can always remind ourselves of what social work is. So that's kind of a brief background, really, to Social Workers Without Borders and the ethical foundation that we're founded on. I'll now hand over to Naomi to take us into the next stage. But perhaps before I do that, I just wanted to check if there is a question on what I have said so far from the audience or from the chat.
There haven't been any questions coming in yet, so
we'll just carry on.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and if people do have any questions about our organisation, we can always come back to them, and how we work, how we kind of organise ourselves. We can come back to those. So picking up really on what Bridget was talking about in terms of our ethical foundation and the tension in social work around what is the role and what's our professional identity, what is the purpose, what are we doing? And so we very much feel that our role is about upholding and protecting people's rights, but at the same time we completely recognise that there is this tension, and a lot of the work is around assessing who's deserving and who's not deserving, and we have taken a no borders approach quite explicitly, because I've just got an echo back on my microphone. That's a bit disconcerting, but we've explicitly taken this approach because this is really this overlap between immigration and social care really brings to the fore how some people are excluded, and how some people can be treated differently to other people. So we have explicitly taken a kind of abolitionist stance against borders, really, and that we advocate for free movement of people. And so what we're going to look at today is that tension in our role and this tension in different kind of policy and legal areas. And some of what we're seeing is the government really ramping up this rhetoric around criminality for movement across borders, of sort of criminalising people for movement across borders. So a way that can be quite helpful, I think, to think about these tensions is to think through the kind of different overlaps of different legal frameworks that we're working in. And as social workers, we kind of move between these different legal arenas, and it can change kind of what it is for how our role is enacted and how people experience it and what our professional identity is, and can be helpful for us to think about, well, which legal frameworks are we foregrounding and how does that impact the assessments that we end up doing for families and the way that we work with people. So we're going to be looking at today this overlap of the immigration law, and that's very much immigration law is in its kind of core essence about having the legal power to exclude some people, and you know, if we think about the theme of nobody left behind, how does that kind of align with our social work values? It is inherently discriminatory, and it's about the state's ultimate power really to decide who is inside and who is outside. And then we have overlapped with that is social care law and the kind of the frameworks that we're used to using in a lot of our day-to-day work, and that's really about who's included, who's excluded, and how do people navigate the state and their entitlements. And then kind of further along that spectrum, we have human rights law, which is universal and is really about inclusive, that everybody's included and that we all inherently have rights. And importantly, it's about protections from the state. So there's kind of this continuum of legal frameworks, and I think that's quite a helpful model for us when we're thinking about, so where do we sit as social workers and what are we doing, what is the task, and what does that mean for our role and our identity. So just to give you a bit of a very brief background on kind of the policy context. So we are working, our immigration policy has, you know, for a long time and for successive governments, you know, right back to the sort of 1905 Aliens Act, there has been immigration laws that are there to exclude some people. However, in 2012, we really saw a shift in immigration policy, and that was the first time that the idea of the UK being a hostile environment was articulated by Theresa May when she was Home Secretary, with the idea being that the UK becomes such a kind of hostile place that people just won't want to be here. They'll just want to, they won't want to come here, or they'll want to leave, and that was kind of the immigration policy that we have been having now for the last 10 years. As a result of that policy approach, we had a series of immigration acts, and this really shifted, and this is where it really impacts our profession as well. It sort of shifted borders into everyday life. So previously, enforcing borders was the task of UK Border Force and UK Visas and Immigration, but the Immigration Acts introduced a series of measures that made everyday professionals, everyday people have to carry out the functions of border control. So whether that's landlords having to check someone's immigration status and whether they're allowed to rent accommodation, NHS workers having to check someone's immigration status and whether they're able to access healthcare, or whether they have to free or whether they have to pay for healthcare. Introducing sanctions on employers if they employ someone who isn't legally entitled to work. Stopping people having driving licenses and bank accounts. So all through kind of all aspects of life, whether it's doctors, landlords, different types of employers, people are being asked for the first time to enforce borders and carry out the functions of our immigration system. And importantly, for social workers, you know, we have been drawn into those things as well, and we're sometimes asked to carry out the functions of border guards. So that's kind of the hostile environment in a nutshell. So what's kind of happening now, and I think it's really pertinent, and we're seeing even sort of greater shifts and dismantling of the rights of people who seek asylum in the UK. So we have a bill that's currently, it's just been through the Lords, and there has been some amendments, and it's back in the House of in the Commons next week for further debate. We have the Nationality and Borders Bill currently travelling, making the passage through Parliament, and this, and at its core, can be thought of as an anti-refugee bill. So new provisions within this bill that really dismantle some of our international obligations around the treatment of refugees. So a big focus of the bill is around how people enter the country, and if people enter the country by an unofficial route, their claim will be deemed inadmissible and they'll be treated as a second-class refugee. So even if they then go on to make a claim for asylum and they get refugee status, in that is proven that they have a well-founded fear of persecution, the way that they enter the country will then impact the treatment that they then receive for the rest of the time that they're in the UK. So things within that are that their status, their immigration status, will always be under review. They'll have less family reunion rights, and they'll have less access to some public services. Other things that are really worrying in the bill are some things around the citizenship stripping, but the expansion of the asylum estate and the use of reception centres, so kind of putting people into kind of segregated accommodation, really, and offshore, so making it possible to process people's asylum applications outside the UK. So being able to send people potentially to places outside the UK before a decision has been made about whether they have a legitimate claim to refugee status. And one of what's at the heart of, and I think is really pertinent for social workers to be thinking about, and is really applicable to a lot of the work that we're doing in Social Workers Without Borders, is the kind of political rhetoric around Article 8. So Article 8 is the right to a family and private life in the European Convention on Human Rights. And when you think about what we do as social workers, is really at the heart of what we do, really, this kind of people's private lives and their family lives. But there's kind of a weaponization, really, of Article 8 and narratives that people are misusing this right to a family life, and that particularly around foreign national offenders misusing Article 8. And that's really driving some of the worst provisions in the Nationality and Borders Bill, and also this review of the Human Rights Act. So really, we just wanted to pose the question to people today, like, what are the wider implications for social work if the rhetoric around immigration and foreign national offenders is used to degrade Article 8 rights? And we should be really keyed into that, I think, as social workers, because it's really our core business as family and private life. So some of we've obviously got lots and lots to get through today, so we can do a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the overlaps of immigration policy and social care, and where there's a sort of explicit meeting of those two worlds. So one of the places that you might come across immigration controls, or this kind of is in children's social care for families who have no recourse to public funds. So when a family has no recourse to public funds is a condition that's that's attached to some people's immigration status, and it means that they're excluded from mainstream welfare provision, so they can't get housing benefit or job seekers allowance or tax credits, all of these things that are a safety net. And so for families, the only safety net that is left open to them is Section 17 support under the Children Act as for children in need, so which is there to help children in need and protect them from destitution and homelessness. So there's a tension in families' experiences of this. So on the one hand, social workers, this is the only, children's services is the only safety net, but families' experiences of accessing that are very mixed. So the social worker is, on the one hand, a kind of a source of help, and on the other is very much in a gatekeeping role. So some research, so Project 17, there's a link there if you want to go and have a look at their report, have completed some research about what are families' experiences when they approach children's services and social workers in relation to Section 17 support. And so the findings of that research are people just being given misinformation, just being wrongly refused support, being told that they're not eligible for help, threats to take children into care, so saying, we can help your child but we can't help you, so we'll accommodate your child but we won't accommodate the parent, and then attacks on credibility, so fraud officers sitting in on interviews as part of the assessment, parents being asked to take DNA tests, and Home Office immigration officials being embedded within that process, which Section 17 is a voluntary process, and it's quite, so those attacks on credibility and that quite hostile approach is potentially, but potentially not, quite different perhaps to the experiences that families who have citizenship experience. So why should we as social workers be thinking about the impact of no recourse to public funds, and where does this really, when we're not when we are practicing in a way where we are kind of carrying out, we're gatekeeping and we are acting in a hostile way towards people and not seeing all of their needs, what are the implications for families. So if you look at some of the serious case reviews when it really has gone wrong for children and families, where no recourse to public funds is a factor, the findings have been that poverty has not been recognised and acted on, and this has been a huge risk factor for children and families, understandably. A finding is that immigration status overshadows safeguarding and welfare needs. So children and families, just an assessment of, will we give them a basic service of accommodation and some kind of subsistence, without seeing the holistic person and all of the needs of that family. So for example, there's a serious case review of a little boy who was killed by somebody that his mum had previously identified as a perpetrator of domestic violence. But when they reviewed the social work assessment, the assessment was just focused on immigration status and will we give them access to Section 17 support, without seeing this child and all of their needs. Instability, the impact of instability and isolation. So people having lots of forced moves and living in poor quality accommodation. Increased risks associated with domestic violence, so people more vulnerable. It can be much more difficult for people to escape domestic violence when they don't have public funds to access a refuge, and they're more at the mercy potentially of the perpetrator of abuse, and people being marginalised by sort of through inconsistent use of professional interpreters. And another theme is sort of poor antenatal care. So when we sort of think back to those NHS surcharges in relation to people's immigration status, maternity care is a secondary health service that people who have no recourse to public funds are expected to pay for. So, you know, children even before they're born are being disadvantaged by an immigration status and put at risk. And there's a link here for a serious case review for Ellie, who is a little girl who was found with her mum, and they were both severely malnourished when they were found, both deceased. Really sad. So it really brings it home, like, why is this important, and why should we be thinking about this in safeguarding? What are these sort of systemic risks, the contextual systemic risks from this policy? And then another kind of arena of the hostile environment that we are very much embedded in as social workers is the treatment of unaccompanied children. So some examples of how immigration policy disadvantages and harms really some groups of people and how that interacts with our profession. So what do we know about some things that have been happening for unaccompanied children? So we've put in here the example of the inspectorate report from October 2020 of Kent Intake Unit. So that's when unaccompanied children arrive in the UK, they're taken to this unit, and they're supposed to then be transferred into the care of a local authority and made and given care as looked after children. But the findings of that report, so there's some quite shocking things in there really. So children being held for over 24 hours. One young person was there for 66 hours. Children being transferred to detention facilities, so like immigration removal centres, you know, effective, like children being detained, children having welfare interviews carried out in the early hours of the morning. There was an example of a child, a 12-year-old and his 18-year-old sibling being transferred to a hotel with no indication that children's services have been notified. And importantly, and there are social workers employed at Kent Intake Unit, and there was some statutory guidance that only in the last few weeks was deemed unlawful in the courts. So that statutory guidance has been removed, but the real concern about the age assessments that have been being carried out at Kent Intake Unit. So there were, from summer 21, there were 238 of these short form age assessments being carried out by social workers at Kent Intake Unit, and 201 of those deemed them to be adults. And what we're sort of seeing in the work that we do is then later on these children showing up in local authorities dispersed all over the country, and actually them being deemed children. So the risks for children are pretty high when we get their age assessment wrong. So, and then really importantly, for what we're thinking about today, something that has been happening since July 21, is, so in July of last year, Kent Children's Services stopped accepting children, unaccompanied children, into their care, and the Home Office and they do continue to place children in hotels, and it's really, these children, it's really unclear, it's kind of a muddy kind of legal framework, really, because they're not being accommodated by a local authority as looked after children. So they're not being cared for, they're being denied their rights as set out in the Children Act. So when we're thinking about today, you know, who's deserving, who's undeserving, nobody left behind. You know, even here in the UK, it seems that some groups of children can be excluded from our kind of core social work legal frameworks of what we think it is to be a social worker. And I guess that in and of itself is awful, but we also have to ask ourselves, you know, where does this stop? If we can exclude some children and deny them their rights in the Children Act, why not others? So I think for as social workers, we really need to be keyed into what's happening and what it means for our profession. I'm just really mindful of the time. It's 7:10. Probably should. Well, we're okay for time. And then so some of what's in the Nationality and Borders Bill is really the key issue. One of the key issues is really around age assessments. And in the bill is the proposal for the creation of something called the National Age Assessment Board. And this will be, so there's some things, there's provisions in there about the use of scientific methods for assessing children's age, without real clarity at the moment about what those scientific methods will be. But some of the medical royal colleges are not supporting the use of these scientific methods as accurate or ethical. But really sort of key to this is that there will be this National Age Assessment Board will be under the Directorate of the Home Office, and they will employ social workers just to do age assessments. And there's some links here for further reading if you want to find out about this. But, you know, going back to, you know, one of those first slides we looked at and those different legal frameworks that we're working in, you know, whether it's immigration policy, social care or human rights law, that really changes what our role and the purpose is. And I think this shift to a National Age Assessment Board should be sounding some alarms for us as social workers. So that's a little overview of things that we should be, it all sounds a bit doom and gloom, and things that we should maybe be worried about, but yeah, there are things to be worried about. But what protection is there for children? Because we didn't want to just focus on the negative things. So obviously, I'm sure you're all familiar with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and as our international child rights framework, and really it's from the UNCRC that we have the Children Act. Kind of they came into existence in the same year, but the UNCRC wasn't fully. It has never been fully incorporated into our domestic law, so we've taken a piecemeal approach to enacting that international legal framework. And it was only in 2008 that we lifted the immigration reservation to UNCRC. And so as a result of that, in 2009, we got a piece of legislation that meant children's rights are, in theory, protected in immigration law and procedures. And this is Section 55 of the Borders, Citizenship and Immigration Act 2009. And this places a duty on UK visas and immigration to safeguard and promote children's welfare in matters related to immigration, asylum, nationality and customs functions. So really only since 2009, in immigration policy has there in theory been some protection for children's rights in immigration decisions. However, And I think this is something that we see in our casework in Social Workers Without Borders, is that Section 55 isn't really robust enough and it's not really working. This is perhaps evidenced by some of the things that are happening in places like Kent Intake Unit, and in some of the decisions that we see in our casework from the Home Office about children's immigration status. And we just put this quote in here from Colin Yeo's book, Welcome to Britain, where he's talking about an inspection of the Home Office's treatment of child refugees in 2018. And so he identifies, so they did an inspection of children's refusal letters when they applied for refugee status. And the inspectors found that the letters simply stated that best interests had been considered. There was an example where it had clearly been a copy and paste from a different decision, because some of the information was factually wrong. But of the 12 children that the inspectors looked at when they looked at their cases, none of them, of the 12, none of them, the Home Office gave them refugee status. And at the point of the report being completed, 9 had appealed the Home Office's first decision, 6 of which had been won at appeal and 3 were still waiting to be heard. So of the 12, 6, like 50% of them, the Home Office had definitely not made the right decision. And so it's the courts, like people are having to resolve these things in the courts. So I think that's quite a good illustration maybe of Section 55 isn't robust enough and it's not working. So that's the end of our second section. Have we got any questions?
There's a lot of comments, and I do have a chance to look at it because people are sharing different experiences they've had. In terms of questions, the main one has been, how do we volunteer?
Oh, great. That's really
so,
nice.
but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of comment, and do have a look at the chat, because I think, you know, it's about people's experiences, but in terms of questions, there's not been.
Naomi, there's quite a lot of commentary really about the use of age assessments and just people talking about, you know, how they feel about that, and sort of how that kind of, you know, how some are being asked to undertake as age assessments and just the political kind of dynamics around that. So there's a lot of commentary around that, which I think is very pertinent for especially social workers working in children and families.
Yeah, I will definitely look back through the chat. I can't see it at the moment, but also if people want to get in contact, there is information about how you volunteer at the end of the presentation, and we'll get there. But also if people just want to get in contact and have somewhere to talk about their experiences, especially around doing age assessments or any of these things, like we do get in contact with us. Like, we're always happy just to like listen to people's experiences, and people have a space where they can share them. So do just email, like, you know, I think me and Bridget have both been in frontline practice in the local authority, and do appreciate that it's not easy, and it can be really challenging, and sometimes, yeah, maybe it is just good to have somewhere to share your experiences. So if people want to do that, do just send us an email.
I think that's really helpful, Naomi, and I think people will definitely take you up on that offer.
Well, let's move on to the next section and think, what can we as social workers do?
Exactly.
How do we respond to this? Because that's really key.
Brilliant. So I think exactly, you know, what can we do? And I think perhaps it's easy to say, yeah, get out there and get the job done. But in some ways, actually true. We found that by working independently of local government and you know, central government, there are opportunities for social workers to develop different models of practice. And I think part of it is we kind of think social work is one way of practice. There aren't different ways of being creative practitioners. But if you think about the knowledge and skills we have, actually we are so well placed to think out of the box You know, we use that phrase quite a lot, don't we? You know, think out of the box. But it's about developing a mode of practice. For us, what is important is aligning our professional standards and values. And that we're not constrained by the dominant political agenda. And I think sometimes that can be quite frustrating. I think we've spent, what, almost 20 years, 25 years, we talk about managerialism and how frustrating it is and how we are curtailed as social workers. But I think perhaps in that discussion, we haven't really focused on what can we do and are there other ways that we can work. Next slide, please. Thank you. So it's on this slide, I'm just going to pick out a few things, because I think one of the things is, how do we do this in a local authority? I think one of the questions we often get is, well, you are in a charity, so you have much more flexibility. We don't if you're in a local authority. But I think there are things we can do as practitioners in local authority settings or out of local authority settings. One of these points for me is the first one, and relates to what Naomi was talking about, of thinking about needs, not immigration status. And they might seem as though they are very straightforward things, but actually when you're working, and if your drive becomes immigration, that then has the potential of dictating the direction of the assessment. So you're not paying so much attention to what are the needs of this family? What are the rights? That can seem quite overwhelming, whereas concentrating on the immigration status might seem quite an easy one to focus on. So we really need to be mindful of that. I was going to pick on this third bullet point, which is about maintaining a commitment to social justice and anti-racist social work. And really that need of coming back to our foundations. Who are we? What is my practice all about? How am I living, breathing it, or practicing it, if all of those three are possible? But reflection, again, becomes quite an important part. Reflection, reflexivity, all those parts become important. There is, I think, also a need for us to think about promoting a community social work approach. And you know, if you go back to the roots of social work, it was always about communities, wasn't it? Community work, and supporting people, strengthening communities. I think there is a sense, and this is a personal view, of that we've lost that community aspect of our approach. It is there theoretically, but not in terms, I think, of practice, or if it is, we're not seeing as much of it as we can. So it's really important that we kind of think about, what do we know about our communities? Where is social work in our communities? Are we engaging, or it's actually ad hoc engagement? So that approach is quite important. Next slide, please. On this slide, I think the first one is pertinent. Don't make assumptions about people. And this comes up quite a lot. Challenge stereotypes. I think when we're working with marginalized groups such as asylum seekers and refugees, there's so many stereotypes out there, and it's sometimes, whether knowingly or unknowingly, you may find yourself actually drawing on those stereotypes, but do challenge them, and that can be quite difficult in a workplace or amongst colleagues. You know, how do I speak out when something is said that I'm not comfortable with, or a decision is made which I think actually it hasn't considered the needs. It's been based on maybe misinformation or one aspect of this family's well-being. Challenging cultures of disbelief. Research continues to show time and time again that asylum seekers and refugees, or children, unaccompanied young people, are disbelieved. So if they say, I'm 15, there is doubt that, are you really 15, and so on. So all of these are things that can inform in one way or another, how we undertake that assessment, how we conclude that assessment, the decisions we make. And so it's always important to come back to check yourself, check ourselves. So if we challenge, then we think about working in solidarity with people. That is really huge for us social workers. We do need to build those communities and really be vocal about our links, our commitment, and be vocal about our solidarity, because I think sometimes we keep quiet about those things. We really don't want to go public with them because we don't want to be seen as social workers who are political. But actually, social work is political. That's why we're in this business, isn't it? Is to challenge some of the political doctrines around. Naomi, that's.
I just, before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to pick up on a comment I just saw on my phone that's in the chat of someone saying, thinking outside the box can get you in trouble in the local authority. And I was just, so this second point really, and I think what we were alluding to, so about developing our knowledge and our expertise to understand the challenges facing the people we work with, and also crucially to be able to carry out our duties in keeping with the law. And I think something that's really powerful for us as social workers to be able to push back on the systems that we're working on is just like knowing the law and really understanding because a lot of the time the statutory guidance it is there, the framework potentially is there as if we as social workers know how to use it. And I think that's what keeps us all safe in our practice, is knowing that we are working inside the law. But the more you know it and can effectively use it to push back, I'm just reminded of just yesterday evening having a fantastic conversation with one of our case coordinators who works in the local authority, and she was talking about how she's pushing back on some of the things she's seeing in her local authority through really getting down to the nitty gritty of what does working together actually mean and what should we be doing. So I think it's a point maybe around, and I know that it's huge, absolutely, what we're expected to know about in the legal frameworks and the guidance, and it's huge, and there's so much, and we're all so busy just trying to fill in the endless amounts of forms that we've got to fill in, let alone do the work with families. But if you can find the time to really know your stuff and be an excellent social worker, that gives you the framework to push back and keep yourself safe. So yeah, moving on, what can we do? We have only got a few minutes left. We might have to rush through. So campaigning is something that we do in Social Workers Without Borders. We use our professional voice to raise awareness, and as a collective we're much more powerful. As a profession we're much more powerful than any of us are as individuals. So campaigning is a key part of what can we do. We do have some leverage of social workers. We've just got a slide in here really about sometimes we think what is it to be in a caring profession. Sometimes we think that caring is something that happens on a one-to-one level. And that's kind of what we're doing in our caring professions, is this interpersonal. We work with people, we work with families, work with children. But social work, what does love and care look like on a kind of a bigger community, societal scale? It looks like social justice. So like Bridget was just saying, being a caring profession, being a social worker is an inherently political task. And the pursuit of social justice is the core of what we can do. So we can come together and pursue that together. Educate. This is really going back to the strands of our work. And there's a couple of links in here. It's just plugs for some events we've got coming up. So there's one on the 7th of April. If you want to join us, and we're part of the Solidarity Knows No Borders network, and we're really looking at solidarity with social workers and mobilising social workers, and education for social workers, and then we've got another piece of training that we're offering on the 21st of April, which is called Protecting Children and Young People Seeking Asylum in a Hostile Environment. So do sign up for those. And then there's a quote here from Colin Turbett, and it is just really about that collective power. And what can we do? We can get together. So whether it's through protests, political pressure, in our workplaces, through our unions, through our professional associations, or volunteering and joining campaigning groups. And what can you do? Give your time, volunteer with us. We would really love to hear from lots of you, and we can't do the work that we do without our fantastic, amazing network of volunteer social workers who use their skills and their expertise to complete assessments, and these can be really life-changing for families. So if you want to do something after this, do get in contact with us. You'll have these slides, so you'll have all this information, but stay in touch with us and we would love to hear from you. Is there any questions?
Wow, Bridget and Naomi, thank you so much. I think there's the love for social workers without borders is definitely coming through in the chat, and people just really feeling inspired and sort of rejuvenated, I think, about just hearing from both of you and the work that your organisation is doing. And I definitely think you're going to get some recruits from tonight's session, some social workers definitely really keen. So lots of people asking about how to volunteer, and obviously you provided that information. I think, you know, what's really also important is that as registered social workers, we have our set of professional standards which are set by Social Work England, which speak to many of the things that you've talked about. They talk about social justice, they talk about challenging discrimination. You know, they are the values and the core values that we all sign up to as being social workers, and it can be challenging at times to kind of, you know, how we fit and how you navigate that within the legal framework. But I think you've given a brilliant presentation in reminding us of those values, of those core values. So thank you very much. Thank you so much for everyone who's attended. Just a reminder that this is a really good opportunity. I couldn't leave without saying this, that as registered social workers, we're required to upload our CPD. So I think this is a really good session to reflect on and think about the impact that this session may have had on your practice or will have on your practice. So, you know, it may be a really good session to use. We've also would ask for feedback. I think Kirsty's put a link in the chat. So we'd welcome feedback from you about today's session or anything that you've seen throughout Social Work Week. So just thanks once again to Naomi and Bridget. Thank you so much for giving up your time and sharing information about your organisation, and just, you know, hats off to you for the work you do, and for everyone attending a late session on a Thursday night. We've got some more sessions tomorrow. I think there's one on anti-racism in the morning, so I think that's a very timely segue between this evening and this morning. And thank you everyone for has attended Social Work Week so far. This will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of weeks, and the slides will also be sent out in due course for those that are registered. Thanks ever so much, everybody, and take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.